Good afternoon. Welcome to our talk today. My name is Enrique Desmadarius. I am the director of the Bildner Center. We have presenting today Lucio Rennó Jr., Lucio Rennó, who will be presenting on Bolsonarismo, the 2020 Brazilian elections, and lessons for the US in 2024 and Brazil in 2026. Professor Rennó is a professor of political science at the University of Brasilia in Brazil and serves as the dean of graduate studies. Okay. He has published extensively, including in comparative political studies, presidential studies quarterly, at Latin American Politics and Society, and he has also co-edited various volumes. We are incredibly fortunate to have him here today, and we appreciate very much that he's here, and are looking forward to his talk. We also have moderating our event today Jorge Alves, who's an associate professor at college, and I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm very happy. Thank you very much, and without further ado, Professor Rennó.
Thank you so much, Desmond. It's great to be here. Okay. So yes, as I was saying, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, Desmond, for organizing this. I'm going to be presenting today. Let me see if I can learn how to do this. Okay, there we go. Results from a research that I have been doing since basically I would say 2018, 2017 maybe, on looking more closely at Bolsonaro's effect on Brasilia. I mean, the major motivation for this research comes actually from noticing that the emergence of Bolsonaro to becoming a main political character in Brazil has really somewhat, in my opinion at least, changed Brazilian politics. I think it's a dividing point in our recent history, and understanding this phenomenon, I think, becomes extremely important to understanding how Brazilian politics works today, how the different political alignments are taking shape in Brazilian political electoral competition, and it seems to me as something that is here for the long run. Bolsonarismo is here for the long run. It's not a phenomenon that's a short-term kind of factor that will fade away quickly. I think it has provided enough evidence that this is a long-term alignment and adjustment of Brazilian politics that I think will affect not just our next elections, but the subsequent future of Brazilian politics. In this paper, what I do is I present some data from research that I have done, public opinion research that's part from a broader group that involves the University of Minas Gerais, University of Brasilia, Unicamp, and ESP and EU as well. And the emphasis there is kind of looking back a bit to 2018 and ongoing, and trying to map conservatism in Brazil. Conservatism, I don't know how to say that in English, I always get it wrong. Forgive me. But mapping public opinion towards policy and political issues in Brazil, and associating that with support for Bolsonaro. So I'm trying to check what are the relationship between positions on policy issues and conservative positions on policy issues in particular, and support for Bolsonaro. And it's this alignment, this convergence of conservatism and support for Bolsonaro that I'm calling Bolsonarismo. Another aspect that I want to address on today's conversation is this idea of what happened in 2022. So the second part of my talk will focus a little bit more on explaining the results of the 2022 Brazilian presidential elections, and with an emphasis in particular on this idea of voting for democracy, which was an important aspect of the 2022 Brazilian election. And it basically has to do with transforming regime support and views on democracy in an electoral issue, in an electoral theme, in a topic of the 2022 election And the hypothesis that I've been developing and testing is that your positions towards democracy were fundamental in explaining your vote choices in 2022, which is unusual in the theory or the discussion about voting behavior, electoral behavior, because regime preferences is not usually seen as an explanation for vote choice. Other things are more important, usually like a retrospective evaluation of the economy or your partisanship or your policy or issue positions. But I'm claiming that in 2022, what was very important to understand the outcome of the Brazilian election was actually how you thought about them and what you thought about them. If you were supportive of a military coup, for instance, if you trust or not in democratic institutions. So I'm arguing that 2022 that becomes or was, I'm not sure if that still will remain, and that's what I bring here for debate with you today. Your positions and preferences towards democracy were explain the outcome of the 2022. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, given Bolsonaro's positions towards democracy over the course of his mandate and how the opposition explored these issues during the 2022 campaign. And in those two first parts of my talk, I'll make some parallels to the case of the United States. Desmond kind of pushed me to talk a little about the US case, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm glad he did, because this is part of this paper that I'm working on the second part of my talk, because I think the parallels with Trump, at least in his prior election, are very, very obvious. Not so sure about this current election, and that's also what I want to discuss with you towards the end, the concluding parts of my talk. I'm going to show some data about the most recent election that's still taking place in Brazil. We're still having the 2024 municipal elections in Brazil, where we vote for mayors and council persons for our over 5,500 municipalities. So we had the first round of these elections in October 6th, and now we're going to have the second round on October 27th, if I'm not mistaken. And some of these results indicate or corroborate part of my initial arguments, in that what we're seeing in Brazil is a consolidation of conservative issue positions electorally aligned around the political agenda of Jair Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo. And what we see in 2024 is the institutionalization of this project around the PL, the Partido Liberal, which is has been Bolsonaro's party for the past 3 or 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, as well, and has incorporated a lot of his supporters around the country. And as you will see, the PL did really well on the first round of the 2024 municipal elections. So it shows the interiorization, the movement towards the interior of the country, and of increasing, say, the capillarity of Bolsonarismo across Brazil. And I think 2024 provides some evidence of that builds upon the very already impressive results that Bolsonaro himself had in the 2018 and 2022 elections. Even though he lost 2022, he did really well in that election, and that's something that. And finally, I hope we can discuss here together what are some of the implications for the upcoming elections, both in the U.S. as well as. Can somebody please tell me when I'm done? When my time is over? So let me move ahead here. With this first part, which is this idea of consolidating conservative. And my point is basically that Bolsonarismo represents a far-right political, ideological, electoral alignment in Brazil based on political issues. I think you can read that. And it has to do with the convergence of popular preference over a certain range of issues with those defended by Bolsonaro in his rhetoric. And this has been, in my argument, highly consistent over the years. I'm measuring this since 2018 until today, basically. There's a very close, coherent, consistent adoption, say, of these issue positions by the core, hardcore Bolsonarista supporter, which I'm measuring in my surveys oscillating around 20% of the. So you see a significant 1 in 5 Brazilians are today Bolsonaristas, hardcore Bolsonaristas. These are not the eventual Bolsonaro supporters. These are the ones who present consistent and coherent policy preferences aligned with the Bolsonaro political agenda, which is and this assures that Bolsonaro has a permanent space on any second round of Brazilian in the near future. Him or his or somebody, right? Bolsonarismo and its relationship with conservatism is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Sorry for the title. It has to do with a cultural reaction or backlash towards progressive gender and LGBTQAI plus political agenda and rights. So it's very closely related to gender politics and discussion of gender politics. It is clearly associated with a defense of harsh law and order policies. So combating crime and corruption is an essential aspect of Bolsonarismo. It has a clear liberal economic, or as we would say in Latin America, neoliberal economic perspective, open economy, less taxation, smaller state, so on and so forth. And it has a clear position against affirmative action, even though it is much more ambivalent towards, say, conditional cash transfer policy in Brazil. Even though also critical of Bolsa Familia, they actually tried to change the name of the program and give it a new directive, but not as resistant as this agenda is towards any type of affirmative action. So these are kind of the core elements of Bolsonarismo that I had already identified on my research in 2018 elections when I was explaining vote choice for Bolsonaro in 2018. During his term in office, we saw the emergence of other elements that are associated with Bolsonarismo, which has to do with negationism and negating science in general. But in this specific case, it came up very clearly in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Bolsonaro became a spokesperson of denying the relevance of the disease, positioning himself against any of the recommended World Health Organization propositions and recommendations. And that actually expanded to a much broader view on, say, environmental issues, on saying the role of universities in Brazil, negating overall the importance of science in Brazil. So that's another dimension of Bolsonarismo that stronger as with him in power. And finally, what we saw also during his term in office was a very closer relationship or clear relationship between Bolsonarismo and Bolsonaro supporters and authoritarian political. So we saw protests against lockdown measures in the pandemic, defending a military coup with Bolsonaro in power. That rhetoric emerged again in Brazilian politics, and it hadn't been there for a very long time. So there was a resurgence of authoritarianism and say authoritarian enclaves in Brazilian society that spoke out based on Bolsonaro's somewhat ambivalent positions towards democracy, to say the least. So this combination of dimensions is what I'm referring to as Bolsonarismo, and it has to do with how Bolsonaro has positioned himself, and he has over and over again expressed his positions very clearly on these different topics in a very conservative manner, and backed and also present, I would say, in his electorate, in that core basis of support that today adds up to almost 20% of the Brazilian. So Bolsonarismo for me is the consolidation of this far right-wing conservative, okay? Organized politically for the first time, I would say, nationally and covering so many different. So what we do in this study that I've been conducting is also looking at a bit of what happens to Bolsonaro after 2022. As you know, he barely lost the election in 2022, and he had his electoral rights canceled in a 2023 trial that condemned him for abuse of political power. So he's unelectable. In 2026, he can be elected again in 2030. However, he's also involved in other trials that might prohibit him from running permanently in Brazil. So the one issue that comes up to mind is what happens to Bolsonarismo and to this conservative kind of alignment in the absence of Bolsonaro as a electoral contender for the presidency. So we try to address that as well in our research. Let me just briefly talk about Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo as the current expression of this conservative alignment in Brazil. It's obviously not the first time or the first leader we have in Brazilian history that has defended conservative positions with certain success. We've seen movements in the 60s in Rio de Janeiro with Carlos Lacerda, who was a clear liberal defender of the opening of Brazilian economy, reduction of the size of the state. We have seen Paulo Maluf in São Paulo in the 80s, very critical of northeastern migration to São Paulo and defending kind of the Paulista way of life, very intolerant towards differences and so on and so forth. These are phenomena that have been studied in the past. And obviously, Bolsonarism is linked with this conservative tradition in Brazilian politics. However, I think it goes beyond these two cases because it covers a wider variety of topics and because it has become a national movement, whereas Lacerdismo and Malufismo were much more of local movements in São Paulo and Rio. And Bolsonaro has become a national movement. And it has also strong ties, I think, with the current wave of right-wing, conservative, radical political movements across the globe, many of them with a strong populist inclination, as does Bolsonaro himself have these populist tendencies. And this links Bolsonaro, say, to this international setting of which Trump is also, right? Of which the radical right-wing parties of Western Europe are also part. And that Casmude has, I think, pioneered in the study of this new kind of wave that has taken over politics in recent years. And I mean, it has been when he's talking about the radical right-wing parties of Europe, he says, I can't really define them, but I know what they are. You know, you can identify these political movements, even though it's harder to pinpoint exactly their exact characteristics. And what I was doing with Bolsonarismo is try to actually think of those characteristics as well. They resonate with some of the descriptions that we've had of even Trump and also of other right-wing movements across the globe. So racism, xenophobia, nationalism, anti-democratic dispositions, extreme nationalism, the list goes on. Anti-communism. It's a significant list of attributes that usually have to do with intolerance in politics, with a backlash towards progressive agendas that have pushed forward rights of minorities. It has a lot to do with rejection of gender politics. So these are kind of the general characteristics of these movements that associate and link, say, Bolsonaro and Trump in the Americas for sure. So this is the broader setting in which Bolsonarismo is inserted into both historically in Brazil, given that we have a long tradition of conservative movements and leaders in Brazil, but also in the current historic moment that we live transnationally, where we see the emergence of these types of agendas and leaders in many different places. And that's what I think pulls Brazil and the United States very closely together when we're thinking about current elections here and the next elections in Brazil as well. A lot of what's happening, say, with Bolsonarismo in Brazil is also happening with Trumpism in America, in the United States. And I think there are patterns that we could think together afterwards of how these are going to be expressed and are being expressed in this year's election, how they were in the past election in the US, and how they might occur in the election in Brazil for president in a couple of years. Okay. The data, as I said, comes mostly from public opinion surveys that we've been collecting since 2018. These are cross-sectional representative samples of the Brazilian population, both urban and rural. And we've been doing surveys annually, and we have done in 21 and 2024. I don't have the data here for the 2024 survey to present to you, but I can mention to you that I have looked at it. I just haven't been able to insert it in the analysis yet, but the patterns remain the same. So what we see in 2024 is a continuation of what I'm going to be presenting to you here very briefly. So some of the data, right? What I'm looking at are these preferences of the Brazilian electorate towards these issues. So the question is basically, are you in favor of or against same-sex marriage and so on and so forth for the scope of this battery of issues? I think this is the longest battery of policy issues in any Brazilian survey in history. I don't think we've had this broad variety of positions, of voters' positions on issues. And this is the Brazilian population as a whole. These are not just the Bolsonaristas. So my point here is that the Brazilian population is incredibly conservative. If you look at, say, legalization of abortion, 80+% are against the legalization of abortion, right? 12% to up to 18% in 2021 are in favor of. As you know, Brazilian law stipulates that women who get an abortion can be imprisoned, right? And if you look at the data, around a third of the Brazilian population is favorable to keeping the law that way, which is a very harsh, right, law, I think, and most progressive thinkers would think, even though it is reducing. And this goes on, so reduction of criminal age had 81% of support in 2018. It's fallen to 65, but it's still a majority of the population that defends the reduction of criminal age. Only a third is favorable to the decriminalization of drug use in Brazil. So what I'm arguing here in some ways, and we can obviously discuss this data afterwards, is that the Brazilian population is fertile ground for an agenda like the Bolsonaro agenda. There's a lot of space for the strengthening of a conservative right-wing, far-right actually, wing agenda in Brazilian politics. And it's much easier for you to be a far-right, extreme political leader in Brazil than a left progressive political leader in Brazil. It's much more difficult to convince people of your progressive agenda today in Brazil than it is to convince people of supporting a more conservative right-wing agenda in Brazil. And later, as you will see, I correlate these preferences with support for Bolsonaro. And correlations are very strong. So that's the evidence I'm providing of this alignment of conservative issue positions with Bolsonarismo. Bolsonaro has basically become the spokesperson of conservatism. He's the leader of the far-right conservative political agenda in Brazil, and that's what binds him to his voters very strongly and puts him as the main political leader in the right. Um, so also another interesting point here is relative stability of these aggregate measures over time. Right? I mean, you see a significant, in some cases, you see evidence that the population is actually becoming a little bit more progressive, right? But overall, there aren't many significant variations. And also, we look at anti-democratic preference, right? Which is important for my discussion of the 2022 vote. And here, what we're focusing on basically is support for a military coup. So we asked people if they would be favorable to a military coup under certain circumstances. And these would be high unemployment, high crime, high corruption, right? That we focus on this study. And we can see a significant portion of the population favorable to a military coup if crime is high and if corruption. Some variation over time, right? 2020 is a different year. It's a survey that we did over the phone during the pandemic. So it's slightly different from the rest. The results are a little different, but overall you see somewhat of a significant portion of the population, almost half, supporting a military coup. And we also measure this trust in the main democratic institutions, right? The Supreme Court, political parties, and Congress. And then we add to this the electoral system. Bolsonaro, like Trump, was very critical of the vote counting system in Brazil, and worked very diligently to discredit and delegitimate the Brazilian voting counting system based on the electronic ballot. And you see that this resonates with about a third of the population, which is also for justice, as well as the electronic ballot. And overall, you see high percentage of the population dissatisfied with democracy in the country. These are the variables later, some of these that I'm going to explore in explaining vote choice in 2022. Okay? And as I said, we measure support for Bolsonaro as those who voted for Bolsonaro in prior elections and who positively evaluate his government. It's a combination of two variables so that we capture a stronger relationship between the voter and Bolsonaro. So it's not just those who voted for him, but may be dissatisfied with his performance in government, but it includes this more, I would say, rigorous approach to capturing what Bolsonarism would represent. These are the ones satisfied with his government and that voting for him. And that adds up to about 20% of the Brazilian population. So that's where that evidence is coming from. And finally, we do some analysis of this political alignment using regression analysis, multivariate regression analysis, focusing on the probability of voting for or being supportive of Bolsonaro, being a Bolsonarist. That's the dependent variable that we are looking at. And the issue positions being our explanatory variable, what increases if these variables increase the probability of support Bolsonaro. And we see the relationship of some of these things with Bolsonaro consistently over time. Whatever has a star there is indicating that there is a statistically relationship between, say, your position favorable towards the reduction of criminal age, increasing significantly the probability of being a Bolsonarist. Okay, so that's how you stable same-sex marriage. You see the same Death penalty, you see the same. In just one case, actually, legalization of abortion actually is very consistent over time, and so on and so forth. So you see a close relationship between support for Bolsonaro and policy positions, especially abortion and especially issues related to crime. So those are two that very strongly from the analysis we're doing. And the second part, right, of my talk is more oriented towards the 2022. So in 2022, what we saw in Brazil was a significant concern of a part of analysts and the population as well, that Bolsonaro would not accept the outcome of the election, and that he had planning all along some kind of coup that would maintain him in power, independent of the election. Right? So the issue of democracy, actually the discussion about democracy, let me put it that way, became an electoral issue, became an electoral concern. And that led us to believe that, or to think that it might be important to consider that your preferences towards democracy may have been fundamental to explain your predisposition to vote in favor of or against Bolsonaro. So we are arguing that those who say defend a military coup and who do not trust democratic institutions and who trust the military, for instance, would be much more inclined to vote for Bolsonaro than the other way around. That's the main argument that I want to discuss here today. On our study, we look also at issues regarding the pandemic and the electoral consequences. I'm not going to go into that much because I don't think we have that much time, and I want to explore some other aspects. So let's focus on this question of democracy as an electoral topic and affecting vote choice or not. And again, what we do find in Brazil, I don't know if you can read this, but we do find some effects of trust in political institutions, reducing the chances of voting for Bolsonaro. Actually, mistrust increases the chance of voting for Bolsonaro. It reduces the chance of voting for Lula. Okay, so this is the contrast between voting for Bolsonaro and voting for Lula in the 2020. This is a post-electoral survey. We asked people who they voted for, and then we asked some of those issues and positions towards democracy that I mentioned. So we see all the variables related to trust in institutions, to trust in the military, the voting system, support for a military coup, all of them having the expected effect on the probability of choosing between Bolsonaro. And this, we argue, provides evidence that voting for democracy was an important issue in the campaign because it was an issue in which Bolsonaro was quite ambivalent during his term in his defense or his positioning towards democracy. Actually, whenever he positioned himself, was in some ways contrary to democracy. And on the other hand, the opposition led by Lula during the campaign strongly exploited and explored this aspect of Bolsonarismo, its risk to democracy, as a reason to not vote for him, instead to vote for Lula. And the opposition coalition exploited this topic very strongly during the campaign. And it obviously had a consequence in the end choice of voters, because those who were prone to defend democracy and concerned with democracy were much more likely to vote for Lula. And I think there's a parallel here with the case of the United States, especially in the prior election, 2020, right, when Biden and Trump were competing against each other. And I think the issue of Trump as a risk for democracy was an important topic here in the United States as well. I'd love to hear you about this when I'm done here and discuss a little about the case of the United States. I think that that was an important aspect of the 2020 elections. I'm not so sure if it still is in 2024. But I think that the idea of voting for democracy is something that kind of pulls US and Brazil together in these elections in which you have um, uh, authoritarian or populists with an authoritarian inclination running for office. And very briefly, 2024, just so that we have an idea of this, what we see, as I argued, is an institutionalization of Bolsonarismo through the rise of the Partido Liberal, the PL. It has done very well, as we will see, and it has launched Bolsonaro's supporters in many of the main capitals of Brazil and in many of the big cities in Brazil, and they have done really well. So this is kind of evidence that you see some kind of a consolidation of an institutional project around Bolsonarismo with a party behind it, which is something very different from what was there in 2022 and even in 2018. And this is a minor point. We also see a consolidation, as we usually do in our municipal elections, of these catch-all parties that compose the center of Brazilian politics, very amorphous ideologically, but very strong and pragmatic in controlling localities and Congress. So what we see in Brazil is a very kind of conservative Congress as well, which, as I said, makes it even harder for a progressive left-wing government to govern and to implement its more progressive agenda in Brazil. And this is only solidified by the results of the municipal election. And finally, a low level of performance of the left and the Workers' Party in local level dominance in Brazil. So as you can see here, the PL is the party that grew the most compared to 2020 and 2024. This is the number of votes the party received. So it had a 236% increase from one election to the other. And it's followed by the traditional Centrão parties, the middle parties of Brazilian politics, PSD, MDB, União Brasil, and look, the PT is not doing so bad. People are kind of making the argument that this was a huge defeat the left. I don't think so. It's just that the left is not a municipalistic kind of partisan organization. They're very important in national politics and less in municipal level politics, but you still see them doing relatively well. But who does really well in these elections are the centrist catch-all parties and the PL, the very conservative party that really increased its presence in 2024. And here's wait, let me go. Well, I need to go back here. Let me see how it is. Okay. Yeah, and here's just to show you the size, right, of these different parties over time, right? And what we have is the confirmation of what we showed here of this graph. I'm actually confused. I think it's the same graph. Maybe same chart. Yeah, it is, right? No, hold on. Yeah, I think I copied the same chart. I was going to show you something else. Sorry about that. So still, the message is the same. PL increases significantly, and you have the stronghold of the conservative parties, catch-all parties in Brazil. And you see a significant decrease of the Workers' Party over time and the number of mayor offices in the country. So I'm going to conclude here just pointing out some of these aspects to kind of orient our discussion now and kind of guide our discussion. First, I think the evidence presented shows that Bolsonarism is here to stay, even if Bolsonaro cannot run in 2026. So the issue is who's going to be the candidate of Bolsonarismo in 2020. I think that's the big question in Brazilian politics today. And we have some names that emerged in the municipal elections, like Pablo Marçal in São Paulo. Some analysts are saying that there's a division in the right. I don't buy that. I think there's a competition to see who's the closest ally of Bolsonaro, who's the more Bolsonarista. They're competing with each other to see who's going to be the nomination of Bolsonaro. Given the stability of his popular support, the consistency of his popular support, and now the institutionalization of his popular support through the PL. It's important to keep in mind that polarization is always higher at national elections than municipal elections. Municipal elections are about the city problems, and what we've seen in this election is actually an increase in polarization at the municipal level, which is actually surprising. And it just shows, it's just further proof of the strength of this division that occurs nationally, and mostly because you have the consolidation of a right-wing conservative movement at the national level today, like you've never had before in Brazil. Trump's victory here will boost Bolsonaro in Brazil for sure, as it did in 2018 in comparison to 2016 when Trump won. So there's a clear effect, in my view, of the American election on the Brazilian election. Trump's victory will, as I said, stimulate.
Don't say that.
Okay. Possible victory. Well, would. There we go. Thank you so much better. So the possibility of a Trump victory here would be influential in the Brazilian election. And the point I want to bring to conclude and to kind of, open the discussion a bit is what we're seeing in the right today is this very ambivalent, ambiguous position towards democracy. The sense that there is a clear defense of liberty. Liberty is a catchphrase for conservative movements in Brazil and in the US. The discussion in Brazil today about Elon Musk and X and the prohibition of X has become a tag of war as part of our polarized political system, and it's part of the Bolsonarista agenda and defending free speech as part of liberty, right? And on the same and this political group also defends somewhat unclear positions about checks and balances, and how you in some ways allow the liberty and tolerate the liberty of opposition and so forth. So it's a very ambivalent view of democracy that Bolsonarismo espouses, and that I think Trump espouses as well. I think they share a somewhat ambivalent view on what is democracy and how it should function, and very much based in intolerant views towards, say, progressive policy agendas in both countries that these two political movements, I would say, share. So I think voting for democracy remains an important agenda in Brazil, and I think it also does in the US, even though I'm not so sure this year as I was 4 years ago when Biden and Trump were competing for the presidency. But I still think that this issue of what democracy does the right or the far right defend, if it does at all? What is the role of this defense of liberty, this open, vague kind of defense of liberty as their position towards democracy? And in the case of Brazil, accusing the left and progressive forces of being communist and anti-democratic in that sense, and Venezuela plays into this puzzle very strongly, and I think the Venezuelan election is going to be as relevant for the Brazilian election as Trump's defeat in the U.S. will be as well. So I'll finish with that, and I hope we can pursue these issues a little bit more as we discuss Brazilian and U.S. politics. Well, thank you so much for coming and for being here.
That was
All right.
Okay, so thank you everybody for having me today, Desmond and the Bildner Center. It's always great to listen to Lucio and to join these important conversations. I'm just going to offer very few just kind of thoughts and mostly questions, just to take a little bit of a prerogative here to start the conversation, but to try to include all of you as much as we can. So I think that the biggest take-home message, at least for me, and I guess this was also from when we looked at the data from Bolsonaro's election, which is it seems that Brazil is much more conservative than people, let's say, 20 years ago, led themselves to be, right? That it seems that the median Brazilian voter is much, much more conservative, right? Which I think that that panel that you showed over the years is incredibly stable at high levels of especially socially conservative positions, religious positions at all. So, and you're calling this type of person who has that view and agrees with the Bolsonaro supports is satisfied a Bolsonarist, right? I'd like to push you in a couple of different ways there to see to the extent that we can, and I'm sure you guys have some questions that you've tried to get to this, is what is the extent of the Venn diagram of the conservative, of the overlap of that Venn diagram, right? Of the conservative who also likes Bolsonaro, but is not necessarily a Bolsonarist, is happy to support Bolsonaro, but would also be happy to support another conservative person. And that kind of person who is a Bolsonarista de carteirinha, right? The person who loves the sons, the 01, and all that other kind of stuff. So part of the reason why I'm asking this is by looking at I've been looking at the data also from the municipal election, which is a little closer to the kind of research that I do, which is this capillarization that you were talking about. To the extent that successful parties at the national level can use the presidency or the federal level to kind of push in or down, right? Which the PT successfully did, successfully to a certain extent in the Northeast and in other parts of the country, were able to shift their electoral base and stuff like that. So my question to you is this: how much do you think that that is actually support for Bolsonaro that's showing up there? Right? Bolsonaro was actually really, really strategic. He didn't travel everywhere during this municipal election. He picked his spots, right? He seemed to pick large cities where the right generally does well. He picked his battlegrounds as opposed to I'm just going to blanket and do a bunch of that stuff. And how much is the right that had been kind of pushed away, the far right that you were talking about, had kind of been pushed away from the center of Brazilian politics since the 1988 constitution, the democratization, all that stuff, how much that it was some of those Centrão people that you talked about, or some far-right people who very strategically made use of that critical juncture, let's say, to then become major forces in Brazilian politics, right? To move the median back towards the right. The part that really registered with me was the surprise of what you said is that we should be surprised that Brazil elects people on the left at all, right? So it seems interesting to me that the PL, but also the PP, and also a bunch of these parties that did really well in this municipal election, might have done so using the image of Bolsonaro, but integrating, using their same power, right? I think of like Otto Alencar in Bahia. I think about a bunch of these other, former Centrão people who consolidated their base of power. So again, I take what you're saying that I think this recalibration and pulling Brazilian politics towards the right, where the far right is a part of politics. I think that's clearly there, but I would like to push you to say a little bit more about how much can we separate the Bolsonarismo personalistic part from the recalibration of the right that happens to have a nice scapegoat is a bad thing, but like a nice thing to like a charismatic person that's like a lightning rod to take advantage of. So I think that's a good to start the conversation, and then we take a couple of questions from everybody. How do you feel about that?
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, or we can open it up, I guess. I would also yeah. I mean, if there are any comments from the audience, we can do that as well. I'll start talking, and then you can jump in, and we can make this a conversation much more than kind of a organized question and answer. I feel that way. So you know what, you're absolutely right that there are more conservative voters in Brazil than Bolsonaro, right? That's the point you're making. Because if you look at our data, and if we were, say, to make a combined index of conservatives, which I haven't done because I think this is truly a multi-dimensional factor. I mean, it doesn't mean that a single person thinks about all those issues in the same kind of manner or intensity. But they all came together, I would say, as different groups around Bolsonarismo. But if we were to think, say, of a latent category of conservative, this would probably be around 5% of the Brazilian that would have all those dispositions, right? Anti-abortion, pro-harsh combating of crime, and pro neoliberal economic policies, anti-affirmative action, right? Those key elements, which I think resonate with the U.S., right? Or with a far-right conservative in Europe, right? I think the issue positions would be very similar. And Bolsonarismo, we're talking here with a confidence interval of something that would range up to 25. So half, right? At most. What happens to this other half? This other half will certainly vote for Bolsonaro in a second round, right? Or against any other left-wing party. In a second round between Bolsonaro and a moderate right, it would be much harder to tell, right? Because a significant portion maybe of this electorate that is very conservative on policy issues might be critical of Bolsonaro's positions on the line. His ambivalent, ambiguous positions of, in certain moments, defending a military coup with him in power, and then backing down when confronted, right, by organized society or by his. That would be a very, I think, interesting test of the strength of Bolsonaro. But I really don't see it possible. I don't. It's kind of the case that wouldn't exist. You know why? Because I don't think it is possible today to consider an alternative to Bolsonarismo in the right. So the 20% or so that Bolsonaro has as true believers are always going to guarantee him or a supporter or somebody he endorses, right? His endorsement will be very important in that sense. In the second round. So I don't think there's a way to test what you're saying. I can see some forms of doing it empirically by saying, looking at those who are not Bolsonaristas and who are conservative and overlapping these circles, as you suggest in the diagram you see. We can explore that a little bit more and see the characteristics of these groups demographically, socioeconomically, and so on and so forth. But again, it's a counterfactual that I think it's hard for us to see the possibility of it happening in the near future. So I'm not sure.
How do you feel about the first round in São Paulo, for example? It's not a clean,
Right.
It's not a clean test in the way that you're thinking, but where you had a more meme-worthy anti-establishment to the right of the incumbent mayor, right? Who then went to the second round, and now we expect a more conservative voter all to flock right to, as opposed to Boulos, of course, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think São Paulo election for mayor has become very interesting because we saw the emergence of a complete outsider of politics entering politics, right? Bolsonaro was never really a complete outsider. He had been a federal deputy for 30 years. He was a backbencher, but he wasn't really a complete outsider. Pablo Marçal, who ran for mayor, and the first round race for São Paulo was decided in less than 1%, right? It used to be the top three contenders. And Pablo Marçal is a crossover between Bukele in El Salvador, right? And Milei, maybe in Argentina. I mean, he's got that kind of style, a young kind of social media star, very flamboyant like Milei, very liberal like Milei, not necessarily conservative, or it's somewhat ambiguously conservative on abortion and things of that nature, even though I think he's not religious.
But he's very anti-systemic.
He's very anti-systemic, very provocative, very aggressive. So he has those elements of Bolsonarismo as well. But Bolsonaro didn't support him to start out with. Just because I don't think he had a chance. He wasn't seen as somebody who had a chance. So very strategical in that sense. Bolsonaro is very strategic in that sense. And then the governor of São Paulo, who's Tarcísio, I forget his last name every single time. Tarcísio. Yes, I always forget his last name. The governor of São Paulo, who was elected based on Bolsonaro's support. He was a minister of support. He was never really that popular. I mean, he's a guy who was indicated by Bolsonaro and won because of Bolsonarismo in São Paulo. So he's very dependent on Bolsonaro, backed the mayor. And that led Bolsonaro, and he convinced Bolsonaro of backing the mayor, who's never really seen as a Bolsonarista, classic Bolsonarista. He's a very moderate. I didn't even know his name a year before the election. And I'm a political scientist. It's not my fault that I don't know the name of the mayor of São Paulo. It's his fault, right? I mean, that's what I want to make clear. I mean, the Nunes was completely irrelevant in politics, and even in São Paulo, nobody knew who he was. Remember, he was the vice mayor of Bruno Covas, who died of cancer a year after he was, or a month. So Nunes had the entire mandate, and he ran for re-election, but completely unknown, uncharismatic, very different from myself. So again, that's thinking of São Paulo is why I'm claiming that this election and the next one, the competition among the right is to see who's going to be the most Bolsonaro-looking candidate in the right, and who's going to be likely to get the support of Bolsonaro as a candidate for the presidency. I think he's that, and I think the mayoral elections that show this impressive results of the PL indicates this institutionalization of Bolsonarismo, because having mayors is important still to elect federal deputies. There's a strong electoral connection between mayors and federal deputies. And then federal deputies are obviously important to support presidential candidates as well. So you see kind of this articulation, not just now between Bolsonaro and the masses, which is this right-wing alignment that I'm calling Bolsonarismo, but also institutionalized through a political party and through participation in Congress and so on and so forth. So that's the ambiguity of Bolsonarismo when it comes to democracy. It's playing the game. It's entering the game of institutional politics. It's not just the outsider who's there to unravel kind of the system and fight the system like Bolsonaro was in 2018, but now much more sophisticated in some ways and therefore potentially more dangerous, even though still not democratic. That's this situation that I think is similar to the US. I don't know. Jump in.
I'm not gonna jump in.
But any
just
question? Yeah.
I don't think it's required. It's
Yeah.
all good.
Eric.
Mhm.
Asked about things do happen at the margins. That's what I don't think Americans have this blanket idea. Democracy is this, that. And part because of our history. We didn't have and so the lessons learned from January 6th, that becomes simple. Canada was the thing that I personally, I'm very I think of we are saturated, have that 30% space. And you have your saddle, not saddle, you have the difference. Balances. So it's filtered or through a character. So I don't know how that part of it. Still better. Simply can't be changed. But that's fine. I don't know if that's
Oh, excellent.
Right.
No, I mean, thanks, Paul. I think that's what I kind of wanted to bring for us to debate. I mean, I don't have answers or even I don't have a strong position, say, on the case of the US as I do on the case of Brazil, for instance. So I brought this up mostly for us to discuss, and I think your points are very well taken. If I agree with you, if you look at survey data from the US in comparison to Brazil, it wouldn't look like at all. And you probably wouldn't be discussing, as we do in Latin America, if you're favorable or not to a military coup. Start out with, right? I think that's a weird question in the US, isn't it? That view of the possibility that I don't know, I'm again asking these things. In Brazil, this is very, well, what happened in Brazil is curious because what Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo did do was legitimize authoritarian enclaves in Brazilian society that were relatively dormant for an extended period. It was prohibited to talk about the military, let's say, or to praise the military for a long time. Actually, some colleagues labeled this the embarrassed right, a direita envergonhada, embarrassed right, because even if you were a conservative, there was very little space for you to openly manifest your conservatism. Still, in the early days or decades, I think, of the new democratic regime. And that has changed significantly. So I think in that sense, obviously Brazil and the US are very different attitude. I agree with you. It doesn't make sense to, or does it? I don't think it did until very recently to ask if you would be favorable to a military. Does that make sense in the US? To answer that question? But
it might have to be
it might after the election.
But they asked that differently here, right? Just to kind of join it. I think in like political scientists in the United States ask questions in terms of that would support a strong, like we really need a person to, you know, the kinds of questions that we ask in Latin America about support for a strong man leader.
Yeah. Or say what I have seen on the few ads I've seen on TV in these past few days here, it's all about law and order, right? It's all
Policing.
The police and,
is
and
more
defunding the police, right? That's a big issue here. Another issue that caught my attention is obviously abortion. I mean, it's still discussed on political ads on the television that I've seen. But what I've seen here in New York mostly are campaign advertisements against or in favor of the police, right? And crime as a major concern, at least up here. Again, I don't know how this. I saw a little bit of the debates, both the presidential and the vice presidential debates here in the U.S. And there were very strong words, especially in the vice presidential. Did anybody watch that? Or was it just me? It's interesting that people were watching the vice presidential debate as well, because it shows how, in some, well, obviously we're very interested. But it was very aggressive, and the criticism of Trump and his ambivalent democratic positions, for me, emerged from that debate, as it had in Brazil a while back. Now, I think the meaning of these things is very different, Paul. I agree with you. That's what you're saying, right? The meaning is very different in one place than the other, even if maybe it is much less of an issue here in the U.S. Well, right? I mean, which the discussion of democracy. Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's true.
Okay.
I mean, I feel very much that for many people, this time around, it's very much a democracy versus authoritarian. And I think that is very much many people, which is why so many Republicans, former Republicans, or have now gone Democratic. I was curious to note that you didn't that you didn't use the F word, fascism. And then I'm not a political scientist either, and I don't know what terminology is preferred these days. Authoritarianism feels a little bland, but because of the presence of fascist and Nazi elements in the right here, I tend myself to think of it as fascism. And it seems that what you're saying with Bolsonarism is here to stay, and the elections are very much a referendum on democracy versus authoritarianism as principle is aligned. That what you are saying is that we might expect in the future to see a democratic candidate and an authoritarian or fascist candidate. That is a regular feature of elections. This is going to be what the elections are going to regularly be, a referendum on the very idea of democracy. Understanding this correctly?
I think I'm not sure if I'm going that far.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going that far. I'm saying that was an issue in 2022 in Brazil. I don't think it was an issue in 2018 in Brazil. That became an issue after Bolsonaro was in power. I think it was an issue looking at the 2020 elections in the U.S. And I feel very comfortable in saying that by what I saw in the discussions that were taking place back then, that Biden was clearly stressing that Trump's victory would represent a risk for democratic backsliding in the United States and the erosion of democracy. I did see that there, Paul. I think that
No, I think that's.
I don't see it as much this time around, but maybe I'm missing the point.
I mean, we haven't had January 6th yet.
In the,
Yes.
The
in
2020
the,
election.
but in the.
Trump's position is not ambivalent democracy. It's blatant.
Yeah, it's not ambivalent.
Okay.
Blatant authoritarian.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. I mean, because Bolsonaro is also clearly an authoritarian figure, right? I mean, and he clearly defends this rhetoric, but when pushed, in some ways, the defense of liberty today, and say Venezuela and Brazil now is an issue for them. It'll be hard for the PT in some ways.
And rightfully so.
And yes, of course, because look what happened in the Venezuelan election. I mean, they haven't delivered what the PT asks for, right? Which is the actas electorales. How do you say that in English? The voting,
Like the voting laws.
the voting laws, right? the Brazilian and Colombian and Mexican government asked Venezuela to make public the voting logs, and they have it. That will be brought up by Bolsonarismo and by fascists. That discussion, that the use of that word came up, I think, in the heightened moment of these public protests in Brazil during the pandemic, when once again the discussion about let's defend a military coup with Bolsonaro in power started to appear after 20, 25 years, right? That we hadn't heard anybody asking for a military coup in Brazil. And there was a reaction, a very strong reaction by, more progressive forces in society saying, no, the anti-fascista movement, right? That gained a lot of street power as well. But I don't think that was the rhetoric used by Lula and the opposition in the 2022 election. It was more of autoritário or anti-democrático than fascista. Okay, and again, as I have explained to you very briefly, I didn't provide any evidence, but that's pretty easy to identify when you look at the rhetoric of the opposition led by Lula in the 2022 election. Right? It was very clearly saying Bolsonaro is a threat to democracy. Look at what he has said, and look at what he has. And I saw a parallel with 2020 in the U.S. very strongly there.
Most definitely.
And I'm not so sure
If
today.
you follow the punditry and the poll, the American populace is not as a two hearing of that. For example, I noticed in your whole display, you don't have a thing in your elections called the economy.
No.
We have a thing. We don't know what it is, and it's bizarrely perceived. But that is the leading election issue in the United States, election after election, especially. And that's what it's being thought about. It's not being thought about only or should be. It's about the economy and inflation and
Economies.
and you can make a list of all these other issues that are down, and democracy is solved.
Right.
And I wish it were, but it's not, and abortion is.
Perfect.
The Democrats, though, have leaned into this idea of 3 days. It's just
Yeah.
I see a couple of questions. I don't know if you want to just keep
Yes, please.
quickly, so we have
No,
Q
no,
and
no,
then we have
yeah.
Matt as well.
Your talk is on Bolsonarism, and isms are kind of somewhat coherent ideologies. And the data you gave us from the surveys show a coherence of conservative values on social and societal issues. And we come back to the question of the economy. How did you use, are there values related to economy and economic policy that are not sort of pie in the sky, well, neoliberalism kind of things, but more specific things? How does the economy figure in the elections, in setting the values there? Here, with Trump saying that the economy is a mess, which it is not, people are believing it because Democrats have not effectively put together the data to show the successes in this post-pandemic era. How does the economy fit in? And back to the question of isms, does Bolsonaro himself, leaving aside the data, does he have a set of coherent ideologies? Trump does not, but Project 2025 would like to at least step in and put it in place.
Perfect.
Do you want to take the second question?
Yes, let's
Or-
take more questions, right? And then
Sure, maybe a comment on the idea of democracy being an issue. I think in the US case, there's a big divide between, we could say, highly engaged voters and less engaged voters, and this has been maybe something that Trump has brought. He's brought in voters who might not otherwise have voted. And then maybe on the democracy side, there's been a lot of messaging, I think, 2020 and even this election about democracy. I think that maybe is resonating with highly engaged citizens, not as much with less engaged citizens. I want to bring that maybe back to what I was thinking in your case, in the case of Brazil. In what ways have Bolsonaro been able to attract people who were perhaps less engaged politically, more ambivalent about politics? Has he been able to reach people, or has he been kind of maybe bringing together?
Excellent points. Let's start with the issue of the economy, right, which Paul had also brought up in some ways as an important device, or as an important electoral aspect of it. And when you're talking the economy, in your case, Paul, I think it's, I missed your name. Sorry. Ken. Nice to meet you, Ken. I think you're talking about two different aspects of the economy, right? Inside. You're talking about retrospective evaluation, right? Is the economy doing well or not? And how does that affect? Is a traditional control in every single model we do of voting. And obviously I have that on my model for the 2022 election. And it is important. I'm not denying that the economy.
But it's not as a variable. It's leading issue in local districts.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
by the way, it's very much right about here, the truth about what's actually happened.
Right.
Was disputed by
I think that that's
the
very
two
interesting.
parties
Yeah.
in a
Right. Yeah.
The Republicans propagandistic much more than
Very
voters. Anything that's actually. So
Very
there's a big difference between that as a discourse and using it as a
Perfect.
variable. The Democrats won this.
Great.
But go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just gonna say that I think what Ken is bringing up is much more of, say, your positions on, or your preferences, or your policy positions on your view about how the economy should work, right? If it's an issue, say, of privatization, for instance, would be a key element. Are you in favor of or against privatization, for instance? Would be an economic policy issue that would be of importance to think of this coherent ideology, right? I think we should use that word, even though we deny it, right? Because of all the implications that it has in defining its internal consistency and so on and so forth. But it's not on this paper, but it's on a different study that we use data that contrasts 2002 data and 2023 data. So 20 years difference with the same questionnaire. And what was the most divisive issue of Brazilian politics in 2002 was the economy, where views about privatization, taxation, imports, right? This was a big debate in Brazil. It's not divisive anymore. So the positions on privatization, on taxation, on the size of the state, they don't divide the population. Everybody has become somewhat neoliberal in Brazil, even in the left. And I didn't make this point here, but I think I should in the future, because I think your argument is very interesting in that sense. And I think how I would respond to it today is that you don't need to have these positions on the economy to have a consistent and coherent ideological far-right position in Brazil, because it's much more related today with issues of cultural backlash or gender politics, abortion, gay rights,
University quotas.
affirmative action, the kind of the dimensions. I mean, the neoliberal or liberal economic dimension that's there, it's not really what distinguishes Bolsonarismo as a far-right movement. So I wouldn't say that it is the economy in that sense that pulls together this ideological perspective, as it did in Brazil 20 years ago, and I think as it does in any classical discussion of ideology, right? Which it emerges from this economic narrative. So that's how I would react to your position today. I don't think it matters that much to explain Brazilian. Oh, jump in, please. Yeah, I'll get to the other question, but it's
Oh, I was gonna add questions.
I think we
so
can do it
maybe
more.
we should Finish. Yeah, okay, so I was wondering how, Amazon policy fits into this, if it fits into this. I mean, I know that in the Amazon region, you know, the far right has, certain interests that merge there. But is that a national issue as well, Amazon policy? And is it, I mean, is climate change in some respect a national issue? Climate change used to be, I mean, environmental issues in this country used to be bipartisan. But one of the consequences of, Trump's influence in our system is that it's and climate change and other environmental issues have become much more, we're much more divided about that. So I'm curious how that fits into your analysis. And then the other thing that I was wondering about is, I thought you said that if Trump wins here, that's going to influence politics in Brazil. Are you saying that that's going to influence how people choose whether to vote, or it's just going to sort of empower, the political elites?
I will.
Elaborate on that.
Let me go back to the other question
Yeah.
because I thought you were going to piggyback
Yeah,
on
I'm
the economy. No, that's perfectly fine. But it's very important and interesting question. I'll get to that in a bit. But let me go back then to I think my take on the issue of the economy as policy preference or a political issue. That's how I would react to it, even though I didn't present data here that backs that sufficiently. Okay, we do ask about privatization in our panel, and it doesn't really, it divides the population in half, but it's not a matter that it's central to Bolsonarismo. Okay, now the question you had, which was about Trump being able, right, to bring in the non-aligned or less participatory voter, right, to support him, to back him, and how that occurs in Bolsonaro. I haven't looked at it, to tell you the truth. I think it's an interesting point. What I do know about Bolsonaro is that through his rhetoric, and that's why I see him as a dividing point in Brazilian contemporary history. It's because he has legitimized and allowed conservatism to come out of the closet, to put it very bluntly. There's no more embarrassed right in Brazil. A direita envergonhada, that I was mentioning here, that Timothy Bauer used to describe Timothy is a political scientist from Oxford, who wrote this book about the right in Brazil right after the military regime. And his argument was this, that people were in the right, but they were embarrassed of defending these positions openly. And today what I see is Bolsonaro empowering and legitimizing a very conservative far right-wing rhetoric based on those issues that I presented here most, which have to do with gender and cultural issues much more than economic. Who are these voters? I don't think they are necessarily the less engaged voters. I think they are probably the voters that have always been against the left, against the worker party. So anti-petista is an important dimension of this, but they go beyond that. That's my argument with Bolsonarismo. It's not just the rejection of the workers' party or the resentment towards the workers, which I think the word resentment is also very important for Trump, right? Trump is somebody who builds on resentment towards the progressive elites. That's how he defeated Clinton, right? I mean, she was the prototypical progressive woman, white woman from the elites, who doesn't understand the interior backward regions of this country. I mean, that was what Trump was talking about when he won in 2016. And I think Bolsonaro does that as well. But I don't think he's bringing in Brazilian politics in that sense is slightly different from, I think, American politics, in the sense that you have this electorate that's non-aligned, right? It's not a petista, it wasn't a PSDBista, it was a non-aligned, and that's why I'm calling this an electoral alignment, and not an electoral realignment, right? I mean, when you look at U.S. history, and you look at the 60s, there was a political realignment, right? The conservatives, the Democratic conservative voter from the South shifted to the Republican Party, given civil rights movement. I mean, that's the important realignment in North American politics, but you went from one party to the other. What was happening in Brazil is an alignment. These people were not aligned, were non-aligned. They didn't have any strong ties to any political leadership. And now they do, right? Now they do. So I think that's the closest idea. Definitely. Let me just say, are you going to talk about this? No. So let me just answer this thing about the environment, which is really important, and it kind of builds up. Yes, so nice, nice meeting. What I would say is that this all fits into the kind of negationism that is behind Bolsonarismo, and that I haven't explored. I have some survey items that capture them, but that's really hard to measure because it's a balance issue. Nobody's really going to be in favor of desmatamento, right? Of cutting down trees or something like that. Those are tricky things to explore from the public opinion, right? But what you see in Bolsonaro clearly and in the more intellectualized, say, construction of Bolsonarismo is a clear rejection of climate change. It's a clear rejection that this is intervention, right? That this is cyclical. And there's again, a relatively scientific argument behind it, like they do regarding democracy and freedom for it. It's tricky because it's denying science and the most kind of advanced positions on understanding of climate change, but also based on scientific rhetoric. It's looking at this qualitatively based on, I think, in-depth interviews, understanding kind of how these things work together in a more articulate way in the opinion leaders among Bolsonaristas is a very interesting, because it's very well constructed, it's very coherent and consistent, but it's obviously linked from a critical perspective of what to a very to a view that is very unscientific about the environment and very favorable to the exploitation of the environment as a tool of development, which builds back to military thoughts about the environment in Brazil and the Amazon in particular in Brazil in the 1970s. I mean, we have to exploit this. We have to avoid intervention from the United States. This is, our land, but we have to use it to the well-being of our population. And it's not an environment. And I think Bolsonarismo reconstructs that in a much more sophisticated and scientific way, even though biased and probably based on poor quality data evidence. But I think the discussion about the environment has gained a lot of time in the past month. This has been probably the most severe weather we've had in Brazil in decades. Severe droughts, severe queimadas, as we call the burning bushfires, criminal bushfires, by the way, as there's mounting evidence that this is organized crime, and to organized crime in its diverse manners, right? Because it has to do with extraction of minerals illegally, it has to do with cutting of wood illegally. What we've seen in Brazil in the past months, I think, brings this issue of environmental discussions and what Bolsonarismo represented to the undermining of control agencies over the environment in the past 4 years as a significant area of research and understanding of the impact, say, of the far right when in power.
Well, don't forget the massive flooding too, in Rio Grande do Sul, which is a highly Bolsonarista region of the country, right?
And strong denial, say, of evidences that indicate that would. So the weakening of bureaucratic agencies that are responsible to oversee these issues in Brazil during Bolsonaro was dramatic, underfunded. So the discussion about underfunding the police is true in the inverse perspective in Brazil regarding environmental. Bama Funai, which is the indigenous of the overseas nations. The federal police as well, which is very active in preventing and punishing crime, environmental crime in the Amazon. All of that was significantly weakened. And I think the result in some ways is the consequences we had in Brazil in the past. So I think I answered in some ways your first concern.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's not a part of the national discourse,
I
but
think it
it's
has
certainly
become, it is
consequential
becoming,
in
yes.
the region.
I think it is becoming a national issue. As, for instance, maybe foreign policy. Issue with electoral conflict, especially because of Venezuela. We position ourselves. So some of these issues, I think, which we didn't need to explore before because it was all the economy, right? And it still is, but it's not just the economy. It's not just that explains election results in Brazil. I think that's an important point of what I'm trying to say here. It's not just in Brazil. I don't know the U.S. Again, I think the U.S. And by what I've seen, some of these issues do resonate, but it's not as clear as it is.
To what extent is right?
Robert doesn't.
So to what extent is the ban something that's like legitimate or institutionalized in the past, right? A la David Sand. That, really getting something more institutionalized, personalist, pro-side, right? I think is a touch point. We can actually look at Trump as institution. Personalization, direction, another way of the same direction. The other question, of course, is violence, right? So we had Android up. But Bolsonaro himself is part of this issue. To what extent do we see more violence, right? And how does that resonate or not resonate with types of violence like neo-Nazis? Proud Boys and other.
Could I follow up on that and ask, are there parallels to Proud Boys, QAnon, and things like that in Brazil?
I don't think there is. I don't think there is such well-organized, visible fascists. I think the word, I don't know if the word would fit, but certainly militia and very violent. There was some of that in the aftermath of the 2022 election. There was an increase. There has been an increase in violence and political violence in Brazil. There's some evidence of that, but I don't think it's comparable, I would say, to even the history of it. And you have a history of internal political terrorists. or not.
Yeah, Clan.
The Klan. The attempt that occurred in Oklahoma a decade or 2 decades ago or something. Remember that, the bombing of a federal building? We've never seen anything like that organized in those terms in Brazil, right? Not sure. I'd love to hear, yeah.
The Brazilian history is issue, military.
That's
You don't
right.
have it.
Yeah, exactly.
What about Opus Dei?
But never really that politically organized in the sense of causing turmoil or public disturbances. It's a different kind of intervention in politics, maybe, but not in the sense of violence. What we saw were some certain episodes of violence once Bolsonaro lost, and that was different from our past history. I mean, the invasion of the buildings in January 8th were preceded by a couple of events in Brasilia that also resulted in violence in the street, attacking the federal police building, an attempt of exploding a truck in the airport. I mean, there were certain events that occurred in the days after the election. I mean, the interruption of traffic in almost all highways in Brazil with the support of the federal highway police. So we saw bursts of those things occurring in the immediate aftermath of the 2020. We haven't seen anything, I haven't, anything that significant afterwards. What we have in Brazil is obviously the organized, the militia, the drug cartels, and so on and so forth, funding the election of politicians, right? That there isn't blatant open evidence of that crime as well, because there's no private funding of or limited private funding of elections in Brazil these days. But there's a lot of talk about the organized crime having the possibility and effectively electing federal mayors in this election, vereadores in this. So you see that kind of intervention of crime and violence into politics indirectly, I would say. But I don't see any kind of similar kind of organization. I could be wrong. It's just something that I'm not looking that much, but I don't see it. I don't hear about it. Well, the military certainly is Bolsonaro, right? The military certainly is Bolsonaro. Yeah, all of the police forces are Bolsonaristas. There's no doubt about it.
The police, more so even.
Maybe. Maybe more so even than the army, than the armed forces. Maybe, but if you talk to anybody in the armed forces, they're much more going to prefer Bolsonaro than me, for sure. And if you look at the videos of promoting the military or the federal police, they all have the Bolsonarista agenda, right? Family tradition, law and order against the criminals and so. So just to conclude, I think the threat in Brazil remains one of the risk of military intervention, even though, again, I doubt that it will happen. I don't think Brazilian democracy is in risk of a significant intervention. I think it
Or
was.
violent interruption,
Or
right?
violent.
Right, direct frontal.
Yeah, I think it was in the aftermath of 20. I think that was the time. Risk of democratic acts. I see changes afterwards in reactions that have in some ways strengthened democratic institutions in Brazil, but that remain, a system that for certain groups it's still unsatisfactory. And I think strongholds of these authoritarian unclogs still remain in the armed forces or and more conservative groups of society and so on. But I don't see eruptions like.
But Trump and his people, CIA, State Department, armed forces, are, and that could turn out on, that is on another person. So I think that we may paradox. There's a transition period here. I'm very good at this. So that's not wrong.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what we've heard from, and there are ongoing investigations now in Brazil about an attempt by Bolsonaro during 2022. And there's some evidence that the military also rejected in intervention. When push came to shove, they said, we're not going to. Whereas Bolsonaro and his close allies apparently wanted to push this as far as they could. And they had the opportunity somewhat by the protests in the streets, the blocking of the roads. I mean, that was during his tenure. He could have intervened in some ways. He chose not to.
The way it's like going back to step and just to kind of like, it's even if the rank and file
Right.
was the top brass, I think sided a lot more with what you're describing, the strength of the institution, right?
Yeah.
The state capacity, that where they say, no, we're not going for this adventure here. Even if a bunch of people are screaming for it.
Even though I think the majority of, say, the armed forces, personnel in the armed forces, the rank and file, are Bolsonaristas and would be in favor of something extreme like that. And here I'm guessing not, there's no data that would back this, but from from looking at things in Brazil and observing Brazil, I mean, I think they would be much more supportive of that than the leaders of the armed forces, or even. So in some ways, we'll have to see, but there is the argument that it didn't happen because these people stepped back and said no. And again, I don't think Congress would buy this. I don't think the Supreme Court would buy this. This is very different from 1964. All these went together supporting the military. And it was a big military coup in 64. You have to always remember that. There was no basis for something like that happening. But the fact that there was so much noise of the say weakening of music or the questioning somewhat. But I don't think there's a chance of significant retrocesso.
They keep only.
Yeah, absolutely.
So otherwise we could stay here forever. But so let me think again. Lucio, and also the Bildner Center. Let's